Today's episode is brought to you by Positively Productive Systems, whose mission is to be the antidote to your stress and to provide compassionate productivity resources and coaching that help you heal and achieve. Be sure to check out both free and paid resources at positivelyproductive.com/resources.
Is either deeply romanticized or it's vilified almost in this way of like, oh God, it's going to be so hard. And it doesn't have to be either of those things. It can just be yours, like whatever your process is.
You're listening to the Positively Living Podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Zaratny, founder of Positively Productive Systems and a productivity coach certified in positive psychology and stress management. Join me as we explore ways to live a more proactive, positive life with episodes on productivity, self-awareness, mindset, entrepreneur life, habits and systems, simplicity, fun, and more. I understand overwhelm personally as a multi-passionate entrepreneur, wife and mom to kids and cats, and as a caregiver. I'm here to help you choose what's right for you so you can do less, live more, and breathe easier. Sound good? Let's get to it. Welcome to the Positively Living Podcast. I'm your host, Lisa, and like a very high percentage of the population, I've always wanted to write a book. And also, like a very high percentage of the population, I haven't. Yet. But my guest today has, and she's helped others do so too. So we're digging into what blocks us from writing, what it really takes to do it, and some simple systems on a free platform to get you organized so you can make it happen. My guest today is Judi Harrington, a business storyteller and author who believes we all have a story to tell. She writes website copy, blogs, newsletters, and email funnels for solopreneurs and business owners, and is the author of Fuckery, The Life and Times of a Legend in Her Own Mind, a humorous memoir in essays celebrating her family's credo of putting the fun in dysfunctional. She's a sought-after editor and writing coach for business owners who want to write a book adjacent to their business. If you've been wanting to write a book for some time, this conversation will do more than guide you how to do so. It'll encourage you to consider when to do so. We do all have a story to tell, and we also have to decide how and when we want to tell it. The options are as plentiful and unique as the stories themselves, and sometimes different outlets make sense. Confession time. I was determined to write a book in 2020. And when the pandemic hit, and I reflected on the message that I had and the reach I desired, I shifted to podcasting and instead, thus began Positively Living. I'm so grateful I deferred that one project for this one, but I'm ready to move back to writing and feel energized by my conversation with Judi to do so. One thing I especially appreciate was Judi's focus on simplicity, compassion, and encouragement when it comes to this big dream called book writing. Those are the same areas that I bring to being productive. And you'll notice the air quotes in both of those, right? We make them out to be something bigger than they need to be. Really, when it comes down to it, deciding is your driving force and habits are the track to get you there. If you feel like you could use some support in getting those habits aligned with your dreams, let's chat. Head to my Connect page on the website, positivelyproductive.com/connect, and message me, or book a discovery call if you'd like to chat face-to-face. I'd love to hear from you. I would love to hear what your book dreams or other dreams are, and see how I can support you in getting there. Now let's join Judi and talk about how to get organized so you can write that book. Welcome to the Positively Living Podcast, Judi Harrington. I am delighted to not only talk about this topic, but talk about this topic with you today.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for including me in the conversation.
Before we dig into how do we get organized and write that book already, I'd love it if you'd share a bit about who you are, who you help, and here's my favorite part of the question. You can always start with that if you want, which is what lights you up?
Words light me up. I am a self-professed, unapologetic word nerd.
I Love that for us.
That's who I am. It's what I do. I'm a copywriter for The Overlooked and Misunderstood, and I do blogs, newsletters, website copy, and email sequences for entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, and small businesses who want to make a better connection to their ideal customer and convert them to action. I'm also a writing coach. I'm also a published author. I probably should have led with that first, but I am the author of, can we say it?
Just this once, because it is the title.
Fuckery, The Life and Times of a Legend in Her Own Mind, which is a humorous memoir and essays that celebrates my family's tendency to put the fun in dysfunctional. And I always tell people that they should embrace their own form of that.
Oh, that was perfectly done.
Yes.
Yes, I would say, yeah. Should we call it bleepery? No, that was done so perfectly. And I will forgive you for burying the lead, haha, and not starting with the author part. But yeah, it's a combination. You've done it. You're helping others. You're in service to them, and you can also do it for others. So
Exactly. Done for you or done with you.
love that. Okay, so I loved the overlooked and misunderstood, and I think that's where you and I bonded because I think I help with productivity for the overlooked and misunderstood in that same way. And so those of us who are that, and it's frequently multi-passionates, multitaskers, caregivers,
Mm-hmm.
we still have so many dreams, so many ideas that we want to get out into the world. And that's something that you support. And that's what we're supporting today in this conversation. So let's start with what's the block? Because I mean, percentages, right? The studies show that between those who want to write the books and those who actually write the books. So congrats to you for being that tiny percentage, by the way.
It is. It's a really extraordinary number. There's a lot of data out there, but anywhere between 75% and 80% of Americans, at least, have the desire to write a book.
Mm-hmm.
Approximately between 4 and 7% get it done. And by get it done, I mean bring a book into publication out in the world. So yeah, there's a lot of blocks around it. I'm not going to say that I didn't experience them myself, and I'm someone who writes all the time. So there's definitely a couple of blocks out there, and I've broken it down to 3. I love the rule of 3. For the multi-passionate and the multitaskers out there, we can usually remember 3 things. The first thing is that a lot of people think that their idea isn't very good, or related to that is that, oh, people have already talked about this. So, for example, if you were writing a book about photography, they're like, oh, well, how much more could be said about photography? And I'm like, well, what you're going to say about photography is going to be very different than anybody else's because it's your perspective and you're bringing your viewpoint into the world. And you can insert any topic area. And that is actually, I feel, universally true. It really comes down to like people want to hear your voice. And I say all the time, I help people get their ideas out of their head onto the page and out in the world. And it really starts with that. Kind of adjacent to that is that people think, oh, well, if I don't write a New York Times bestseller, then it's not even worth it. And I'm like, well, that's kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? Here's a spoiler alert about the New York Times bestsellers list. It's really the best marketed books.
Yep.
The New York Times bestseller list is not actually related to book sales. That's the first block. People think their idea isn't very good. The second block is that people think, well, I'm not a writer. Well, just because you might be an accountant doesn't mean you can't write. But what I think is really operative there is that people have been given a lot of bad writing advice. People sit down to start writing, and their 6th grade grammar teachers in their head saying things like, don't end that sentence with a preposition. Don't start with the word and or but. Don't do this. Don't do that. Oh, where do I put this semicolon? A friend recently said to me, am I semicolon right? And I'm like, I love that you use that as a verb. It's more important for you to get your ideas out of your head first. That's why editors were born and made. If you're writing emails, you're a writer. Like, not that there's a low bar of entry, but I think there are a lot of people who are more in the writing habit than they give themselves credit for. That's the other block. And then there's my favorite one. I don't have time to write.
Oh, that's a good one.
And I tell people, Are you watching TV every night? Are you on the Book of Face? Like scrolling Instagram 3 hours a day? If you want to get a book done, you will find time to write it. And that's kind of really what it comes down to at the end of the day. You have to make the commitment. The book that I wrote had started as a blog many years ago. My kids were small, and I wanted to capture the stories of their fun things, like my older daughter. She's now popularly known in the universe as my Jewish kid. When she was 5, she asked Santa to bring her a menorah. And I said, sure, Santa's going to bring you a menorah, fine by me, and kind of launched into this whole family tradition that we carried on for years, having a Hanukkah party with exactly 0 Jewish children. And that's just one. Then I just wanted to capture the moment. I started sharing, just writing these stories just for the sake of writing them. And I think that that's probably the first thing I tell people is like, write this without any expectation. Just write for the sake of getting it written down because you don't want to forget it. The biggest lie I tell myself every day is like, oh, I'll remember that.
I'm in business because of that. I mean,
right? Exactly. It started as a blog. And then, before I knew it, I had all these stories. And then eventually there was a point in my life where I said, now's the time to get this book written. And that happened to be in the middle of the pandemic after I split from my husband. And I was like, I can't go see anybody. I might as well write this book.
mm-hmm.
And I just felt very called. Writing can be very therapeutic. And it just helps you unleash the ideas in your head and get them out of you, and gives you time to reflect in different ways, really, and just process them. And even if some of those words never meet the page, just because you've written it down doesn't mean it's legally required to be in a book. Like, I'm working on my second book right now, and I'm like, oh, there's some stuff here that's really ugly. And my writing coach, Rebecca Gold, is like, just because you wrote it in this draft does not mean it's going to be required to be in a manuscript. Like, you need to get this out of your system. And writing is not linear. That's the other thing that I like to impart to people. They think, okay, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to write an outline, and I'm going to write all these things, and I have a book done. And I'm like, if only.
Yeah, it doesn't work that way. But I mean, I guess it could if you wanted to try it. But ultimately, what you're talking about with just getting it out of you and processing it, I'm thinking too about the creative process in general. I'm thinking about my son going through quite a time. And I mean, I was like, Taylor Swift, that sucker. Okay. Just create. And part of it is writing because it's writing lyrics. And so that's a good reminder. If you write lyrics or you write poetry or you write an email to someone or you write really, really funny comments in Instagram,
Exactly.
you're a writer.
So many people are writers and don't give themselves credit for it. But those are the 3 things I think that hold people back. There's absolutely ways around it. And for me, it was like I made a commitment every day. I see all these things that write your book in 90 days or write your book in 6 weeks or whatever it is. And I'm like, if only, right? I mean, some people can do that, but I think that, that's not the average person. And I think there's a lot to be said about that. Again, another podcast altogether.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
yeah,
it's going to depend upon the person. It's going to depend upon the nature of the flow state and honestly, how much pre work has been done, probably including the things that you have mentioned already. I mean, you have not only said, hey, I have 3 potential blocks that might keep you from doing this. Let me go through them. And by the way, 3 is like chef's kiss. Yes, I feel those 3. And I mean, the I don't have time is probably the strongest, but it's amazing how each of those, thread their way through our justification as to why or not. And so the big key words, the auditory highlights that I want to do here of what you've said is to write, keep writing, acknowledge that you're writing, write without this has to be done. It's not getting done for a reason. It's not necessarily to be released or whatever. It's the deciding. And boy, isn't that true? I live that. I haven't written a book yet. It's on the list, but you had a pandemic book. I had a pandemic podcast.
right, exactly. But that's what you decided,
Yeah.
right? Like, you can bring your message out in so many ways.
Yeah.
And it's funny too, because I have worked with one of my writing clients, and she came to me, she had a book idea. As we started working together, we realized it was more of a program than it was a book. I said, I think a book is premature. Like, you need to create this program and then you'll get more content and then you'll be able to write a book. And she was like, will you still work with me? I'm like, of course I will. Like, we're still getting content out in the world, right?
Yeah. Let that be a lesson right now. Hear what Judy's saying, that you may be listening to this because you're like, I want to get that book done already. And you do have that dream. Keep the dream, but also there can be something else that can come first and may help. I definitely feel like the podcast helped me and has set me up in a different way completely. The other thing you mentioned was that it started as a blog. And I think that's just a hidden gem in there. That again, it's not the whole, okay, I need to be a writer and then skip ahead and a New York Times bestseller published author. It's like, well, there's stuff in between. I had a client once who was like very driven and I wanted to support these dreams, but I'm like, okay, here's the project management side of it. There's where you are right now, and then there's you up on stage with Oprah. But there's going to be some steps in between. How about we look at those steps in between? Because you never know what's going to come of it. You may decide that blog writing is like your favoriteest thing ever. I don't know, but
And there are loads of writers who started as bloggers. Glennon Doyle is probably one of the most famous examples. To me, it's just important to get the writing out there, and it doesn't have to be perfect. And there's this whole the word performative keeps coming up for me in this conversation, and people think like, I got to do it, I have to do it, I need to do it. I'm like, release expectation, because that's when the real juicy stuff comes up. If you put yourself under this false deadline, you're just going to get in your own way.
right. And what you create too may become something entirely different.
So different. Like, there's some pieces of my second book that I'm working on. I'm seeing an opportunity in there to actually give a TED Talk like piece of content. And so I'm exploring that a little bit. And I'm not worrying about, like, people will say, how's the second book coming along? And I joke, and I'm like, it's a slog. Because I'm like the world's most honest mother and the world's most honest writer. Like, I'm not going to sit and blow smoke and tell you that, oh, it's just going great and we'll be done by that. La, la, la. That's nonsense. It's just nonsense. You have to give yourself the time to do it. At one point, I was giving a talk, but like, yeah, don't be like me. Don't take 15 years to write your book. But now I've kind of pedaled back from that. I'm like, so what if it took you 15 years to write your book? Who cares? You got your book written. That's all that really matters. As long as you get your ideas out in the world in some way, shape, or form. It can be a podcast. It can be a blog. It can be a tiny book. That's the other thing, too, like related to writing a book. I think people sometimes get in this mindset. They're like, if I write a book, it has to be like War and Peace. It has to be really big.
Again, it's that perception of value, right? Because this happens with how I teach habits all the time, right? And this idea that what's 10 minutes going to do? It's going to create a habit that you show up for, and then it's going to be cumulative. One of the first books I ever read that was really kind of in that self-development kind of aha mode, where it really changed how I perceived things, was called The Slight Edge by Jeff Olson. It is on my favorites page, along with all the other books that we talk about on the podcast. And there's also one by Darren Hardy called The Compound Effect. Same idea, right? Okay.
Yes.
Very similar concepts. And it's this idea that you do this tiny little thing that feels like, what could it matter? But here's the thing, and I think it's probably one of the key components of this book that matters the most to me was my takeaway is not only does it matter in that it's this compound effect, it's this cumulative, not just cumulative, but compound, I think is a more important word, right? In terms of it, the exponential development that happens, right? But it's the lack of doing that doesn't just keep you neutral, but it takes you away from your goal too. And I was like, ooh, interesting. So to your point, it's the just right, the find the thing, release expectations as to what it's about. I mean, boom, we could almost be done, but no, we're going to keep going.
No, we're going to keep going. But there's two things that you touch upon that remind me of things. Like, so I was a musician in a former chapter of my life, and I use this tool with my writers. If you're struggling to get into a writing routine, I think of it the same way that I taught my kids. They both play piano. And so I said, okay, all you're required to do is practice 15 minutes every day. That's it. 15 minutes. Set a timer. And before I knew it, They would be practicing for half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour. After a while, naming the time doesn't become the issue anymore. And the book that really shifted for me in talking about books and habits is James Clear and Atomic Habits. And he talks about just do 1% more. And he was a great inspiration for me to get my book off the ground. I heard him on a podcast with Brene Brown, and she asked this really great question. She's like, what's something about you that people get wrong? And he said, people seem to think that because I wrote this book about habits, that my life works like seamlessly and like completely in flow all the time because I have mastered habits. He said, I wrote this book as a giant reminder to myself.
I feel that deeply.
This is what he said. He said, we write the books that we need. And I use this too with my writing clients. I'm like, what are the 10 things or 3 things that you wish your clients knew? I do that on the content side, but also when I'm writing coaching with people, I'm like, you want to write this book about, XYZ related to your business. What are 3 things that you wish people knew about your business? And, take it from there. When I wrote my first book, I wrote this book to remind myself that the 20 plus years that I was with the husband, as I lovingly call him, were not a waste of my time. It wasn't for naught.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really healing and it was very therapeutic. And it allows me to be in the same room with him and not want to stab him.
That hashtag goals.
I was not that zen when I started writing this book.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I was basically refusing to write the last chapter, which was like, we start where we are, and then the bookend chapters, which is where we are now. And it was discussing that we're getting divorced and what that feels like and the lessons I've taken from being in this space. And largely it's like, I've just decided that this isn't happening to us, it's happening for us. But it took a lot for me to write that chapter.
Oh, I can imagine.
So I went and I wrote it and it happened. And not to brag, but I'm going to brag.
Please do.
That chapter didn't require a whole lot of editing because it came right from the heart.
And what an important bit of advice right there. So let that sink in. Let it come from the heart. And also what you're describing here with your book, which will be on the Positively Productive Favorites page, what you're describing is a beautiful practice of gratitude for the difficulties in life.
Yeah.
So what we have talked about is like all of these juicy, wonderful things about why we want to be writing the book, why we don't write the book, what's going on, and some of these little things about, hey, this is how you can get started, these little things, these habits. Now let's dig into, okay, got it. Things are popping up. I have these ideas. I've had these ideas for a while. I have these old notes that I'm looking at. Judi, what do we do as far as next steps to like process these ideas? What do we do with all the ideas and what kind of systems can we put in place?
This is the hardest part, right?
Yes.
So I am a big fan of what I call the brain download. And I'm a Google Docs gal. And I just say, get all your ideas. I call it the laundry list method.
Mm-hmm.
Just write them down. They don't have to be in full sentences. They can be in paragraphs. Doesn't matter. Just get them all into that brain download document. I'm also a Google Sheets person when it comes to writing, and we'll get to that part of the process in a little bit because I don't want to get too far ahead of the process and have people going, oh my God, she wants me to do a spreadsheet for my book. We'll get there. The point is, get all of these ideas out of your head
Mm-hmm.
and onto a page so you can see them. Then you do this in 2 parts. You get them all out, and then you walk away for 24 hours. Then you come back, and you look at this list as if it were brand new, like you've never seen it before, and you decide, which one of these ideas makes me the most excited? Which one lights me up? Which one could I just write something like 500 words? That's all you need. If I were going to write a social media post about this, if I were going to write a blog about this, just go and write it. And that's where it starts. And what happens is that while you're writing that thing that you got excited about, I guarantee you 6 other ideas will come into your head. And this is where people get stuck. And this is where I say, we're going to put things into the parking lot.
Yeah.
So you get that new idea, you put it back in the brain download document and come back to it later. You may find that you go back and grab it to put it into the thing that you're writing, but don't let it distract you from the writing that you're doing. So that's the process I use, and that's the process I teach.
I love it. This should sound so familiar to those who've listened to me even once before, because this process of doing it could be a mind sweep, a brain dump, a brain download, whatever you want to call it, it's getting it out of your brain and someplace safe to start. And that's good for tasks, to-dos, everything that's getting to you. But in terms of these ideas for writing and what you want to do, I love this like part 2 of that process of not only get it all out, but step away and then come back and then pick that thing that's jumping out. Because there's bound to be something that's jumping out. But you're right. Then there'll be more things jumping out as you start to create. The creative process, just like gratitude and everything else, when you do it, it begets more of it. Wonderful, but don't let it distract, right?
But don't let it distract you. And I think there's this notion that people, because there's all these great quips out there about writing. I can't remember who said it, but it was like, oh, writing is easy. You just sit down at the typewriter and bleed. And
Yay,
and I'm like,
thanks. Love that.
don't get me wrong. I find a lot of humor in those things because I'm a dark kind of gal. But I think when people hear that, they're like, oh, God, it just sounds like so torturous. Or they think, oh, wow, it's like writers just like, and people have heard me use this phrase a lot. Writers are not people who like float up to the keyboard with a great soundtrack behind them and start, musing away and like everything comes out perfect the first time. Absolutely not. Most times I'm sitting around like unshowered in my sweats, looking like a homeless person. It's either deeply romanticized or it's vilified almost in this way of like, oh God, it's going to be so hard. And it doesn't have to be either of those things. It can just be yours, like whatever your process is. You have to figure out what your good for me is. And that sometimes is a process too.
And that's where your flow state will come in. That's where your focus will come in. And what you're touching upon, too, that is so important, again, want to highlight this, is the idea that you have, conceptually, like, okay, the ideas are coming in, you're dedicating, you're deciding, right, the time and doing the thing. You are coming at it without expectations, right? And then when you set up the habit, it's imperative that you consider what your environment will do to your actions. It will impact how you show up because we are in such a distractible world. Acknowledging what that means for you, acknowledging the fact that you may have to hide from your family. And that's not only okay, it sounds glorious. I'm sorry, I'm getting distracted by that very idea. But to that point, and I have coached clients before to help them with this process, this creative process, including writing books, coming again from the productivity and habit side of it. And we talk in detail about the environment that you place around you to be conducive to this process. Okay, so the brain download, using Google, love that also because as my biz bestie Liz says, is if it's free, it's for me. That's
Amen.
awesome. So as we wrap things up here, let's sneak in that spreadsheet thing a little bit. You gave us the first steps. That's great. But any other little tips there?
I saved the spreadsheet portion because I didn't want to scare everybody off. So this is optional, but this is also speaking to those who are listening who might have a manuscript sitting dusty in a virtual drawer or a literal one. I stole this from somebody. I have complete permission, but a fellow writer friend of mine, Callie Patrick, I edited her book, Mastering Your Sleep Puzzle, the 12-week guide to sleeping better. And when she and I started working together, I joked, she was one of my first writing coaching clients. And I said, you've ruined me for everybody else, because she had her entire book was organized within this Google spreadsheet. And in each line was a chapter that had a hot link to the Google Doc with that chapter's work in it.
Wow.
It's pretty amazing. And I actually adopted that method for starting the second book. So the way I do it is I have each line in the Google Sheet is for a chapter, and I'll put air quotes around that because they're not hardcore. This is where this idea is getting marinated. This is where this idea is getting marinated. This is where this idea is getting marinated. And what's beautiful about it is that as things have developed, I've been able to move things around to give the shape and cadence that I want.
Yeah, because things are invariably shifted around like a puzzle, right?
Yes.
When you're creating, and that makes it actually easier. Love that.
It really, really does. And then the other thing too, kind of related to the time matter, is that I think a lot of people feel that writing has to be a solitary act, and it does not.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a lot of great co-working options out there. I'll give a shout out to my friends at 37 Minutes, Kelly Murphy and Melissa Bergio and Amy Freedy. Just something about that being, even if we're all working on something different, the energy of being in the company of others. And I know that you and Liz, your biz bestie, do the same thing. Because sometimes she's been on a call with me and I see you in the background, right?
Yeah.
There's just something about the co-working environment, not just for the accountability piece, but there's something energetically that happens and gets you into flow state.
Absolutely. When you both show up in the same energy, you don't have to be doing the same thing. The principles in productivity of like the body double, that psychology of, oh, they're
Yes.
working, I'm working. It reminds your brain that it's time to focus. It's absolutely beneficial. Yeah, it's something that I've been looking into for a while now, and I keep threatening to create my own cohort.
There's something really, really beautiful about it. And I have a couple of other writers that I do co-writing with over the course of the week, and they're working on something and I'm working on something, and
Yeah.
we kind of, bounce ideas off one another and things like that too. And then I think the other thing that I would just want to share with the audience is that there's this whole concept that I talk about called procrastinating.
It's like procrastinate work is what.
Yeah, procrastinate,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Right. So it's people like, wow, I really should be doing this, but I want to do this. And I'm like, okay, to a degree, we all do it. Like I always joke that I'm procrastinating, my house is immaculate, right? So like I'm doing all the things.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
decide I'm gonna like alphabetize my books, or I'm gonna clean out the kitchen junk drawer, or I'm gonna like count the threads on my sheets. Like anything to avoid the thing that you need to be doing. I want to put a slightly different spin on this without sounding like I'm totally enabling people, but there is a certain gift in doing that, is that you're freeing your brain up in a different way
Mm-hmm.
to do this thing. And it's almost like for some people, it's meditation. Like they want to sit. And I've done this too. Like I'm a big fan of meditation. Sit there and it'll just come to you. And you're like, oh, right. It's like we always joke. We have our best ideas right before we go to bed,
Oh, sure.
or in the shower, or when we're driving. There's ways around that too. But sometimes you just have to get into some other task to unknot
Yes.
the struggle that you're having, in the writing, right? That's what I can speak most authoritatively about. And, I wrote a blog about this not long ago about how I was procrastinating around an email with my own content that I needed to send out to my community. And I was just really struggling. I was stuck. I just could not get over this hump. I ended up taking a call with Rebecca Gold, who's my writing coach. I'm in her group writing program. And I was like, there was a piece of me that said, oh, you're just procrastinating. And I'm like, well, something deeper in me was saying, you need to take this call. You need to take this call. You need to take this call. I met with her, and it was right before we kicked off in the writing group. So I talked about like my idea for my second book and where I wanted to go with it and all this stuff. And then once that was all unleashed with her, I hung up, and all of a sudden it was like, in 7 minutes, that email I need to send out to my community was done.
Yep. It shifts your mind. And,
It really
I
does.
love that you're like, at the risk of sounding enabling, but it's this balance, and it cracks me up, but I'm going there with you, and I'm not an enabler as a general rule, but I
Right.
am willing to point out when you need to lean into a specific direction and where the benefits can be in that. And to this point, there's actually studies that are showing that when we step away from our work and especially take a walk in nature, our brains actually come back ready to create and innovate better. I mean, it's proven. So it's not just, oh, yeah, I've seen it anecdotally, and that can be enough, honestly. Anecdotes are fine. And when you know that it works for you, go with it. But I'm just saying that, science is backing this up now. So you're absolutely right. And I love that because that is also permission for us to be human about this, to keep at it, to go ahead and stumble
Exactly.
and then keep coming back and don't give up.
And it doesn't have to be perfect the first time you put it on the page either. There's a lot of things. Jenny Lawson, she's a memoirist and she's very, very funny. One of her books, I think, is called Let's Pretend This Never Happened. She's really hilarious. You would definitely love her work. But she was talking about the writing process in one of her books and how she'll send things to her editor and she'll have like a place marker that say words should go here.
That's
Or
awesome.
like, I want to talk about blah 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 here. And her editor's like, okay, what the hell's blah blah blah? So sometimes editors are doing the Lord's work with us as writers, but again, that's like you don't have to write alone. And that's really what I tell my clients. Like, I'm here to write with you
Right.
and give you feedback on what you're sharing with me. And sometimes, we're sitting there writing together. That really lights me up too, just seeing other people's ideas and what they're coming to the table with.
Again, it's that decide and do it and write without that expectation. But if you're going to get technical, it was my understanding that you're always supposed to have a lousy first draft. So I thought that was a thing. Like your
Oh,
first
yeah.
pancake,
Yeah.
right? Is always a little,
Of course. It's always like the first pancake. Well, Anne Lamott, I mean, she coined the phrase SFD, shitty first draft.
Okay, there you go.
And, so if it's good enough for Anne Lamott, if she's written like 30 books, then it's good enough for us.
Absolutely. Okay. I think this is a wonderful place to wrap up. There's so much inspiration here to lean into it, to believe that you're already a writer, and to take this really simple system that you can use on Google and break it down and just keep going. Okay. Before we get into a fun little rapid wrap up, tell us where we can find you online. And I love your domain name. I already know it, but go ahead and tell us.
It's Judi 411. So Judi 411. The number is just like the old directory assistants. Basically, I'm like a walking information booth is really what it comes down to. It's kind of there's an origin story on the website about that too. But that's where I live, and I would love for people to come check me out, join my email list, download my lead magnet, 5 tips for unboring copy, which transcends copy and really about writing in general. I send out pretty, newsletters on a pretty regular basis and different email sequences and stuff. And there's a bunch of different services out there for the business owners who are listening, website copy. And the latest and greatest has been the email funnel plumber, where I unclog your email sequence to get you better conversion.
Yeah. And again, all of these things, you write better in one spot, it's going to connect to other places where you're writing too.
Absolutely. It just transcends. It transcends medium for sure.
Okay. I'm going to fill in a couple blanks for me here.
Okay.
A song that lifts my spirits, makes me dance.
Come and get your love
Come
by
and get your
Redbone. Your love.
love. Love that song. Okay.
It's a
How about
great song.
a quote or mantra that inspires me or I tend to share a lot is?
We can't see the label when we live inside the bottle.
Ooh.
Yeah, that's a Judi Harrington original. Not to like toot my own horn, but
Well, you might
I
as
just
well.
did.
That's a good one.
If I'm not doing that, I might even live my life. But I say this a lot to clients in the content side of the house. You think it's self-evident, but what you're showing people is something else sometimes.
Yeah.
inadvertently. You're not doing it with ill intent or out of ignorance or anything of that sort. But in order to really speak to your audience, you have to really understand how they already see you and then adjust accordingly.
Yep. Makes so much sense.
That's definitely a mantra for me. And I think that transcends not just to writing, to everything.
How about any resource? It could be a book or an app. In addition to your book and James Clear's that you mentioned earlier, both will be on the favorites page. Any resource that has just made my life better is?
Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird, about the art of writing.
Oh, okay. Probably have her on the favorites page. I don't know if that one is, but by the time you're hearing this, it will be. A last bonus question for you. It's a last but definitely not least question. What are you grateful for today, Judi?
What am I grateful for today? I'm really grateful that I wrote that book, to be really honest. Like, it really has had some transformational powers in my life. And I don't care if it's ever a New York Times bestseller. Like, to me, a book is forever. And it's a great way to leave a legacy. And for me, it was really, at the end of the day, I wanted to give something to my kids. And I wanted something for them. But I'm really glad that I wasn't in the greater percentage of people who didn't get it done. Because I think it's a gift you give yourself when you do it.
I'm so grateful you did it, okay, because it becomes this jumping off point for everything else that you're doing, all the connections that you're making, all the ripple effect that you're having in this world.
It really is.
And then now here giving us this advice, and you will be part of the thread of me writing that book, right? And who else is listening right now that you will be part of that thread? And that's incredible. So I am so grateful that you wrote that book. I'm grateful for you and that we connected.
Yes. Nothing like a little gentle internet stalking.
Oh, yeah.
To start a friendship. There you go.
Again, one more chef's kiss for the road. Mwah. And with that, I will thank you, Judi, for shining your light so brilliantly in this world and sharing it with us.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Thank you for joining me today. Your time is precious and limited, and I'm honored you chose to spend it with me. If you have feedback, questions, or want to schedule a chat, head to positivelyproductive.com/connect. And if you are looking for any of the resources referenced on the podcast, from books to products to training and more, go to positivelyproductive.com/resources.